I'm sorry, let me try it again. The Kathy Fiscus happened on June 1949.
What were some of the other remotes that you did early on?
Well, we talked about so many of them. A lot of them were shows, and quite a few of them were news. I would like to tell you a little excerpt on what happened on one of the days that I had just completed 10 remotes. That was we used to do wrestling at the Olympic Auditorium on Grand Avenue in Los Angeles, and that was the one I had to also direct. And that day, after that full day, we had to clean up what we were doing and get on our way and set that up from scratch for the show. It started at 8 o'clock at night. We wanted to go to dinner, so the fellow that was driving the truck, once we got going, was going along at a pretty good clip. Well, along the way, all of a sudden he drove right across a huge pothole. And when he did this, the equipment shook like you wouldn't believe. It was like a cat had hit the side of the truck. And I thought to myself, boy, we got a problem here. And I remember saying, we're the only people in the whole world that know that wrestling on television is not going to be on tonight. And I could just visualize that not only the cameras, but the microwave transmitter, which was our own homemade transmitter that I had actually helped build to get the signal from the remote up to Mount Wilson, was going to be in trouble. And so we got there, and sure enough, after setting up, we turn on the microwave, and Mount Wilson advises that we're not getting a signal. Well, very disconcerting, and I know I worked my heart out trying to make that microwave transmitter work, and it was getting close to the time. We'd forget dinner. I mean, we were coming up to airtime, and all of a sudden, for some reason, and I don't know why he did it, but I gave that microwave piece of equipment a big frustrating kick. And all of a sudden, Mount Wilson called on the phone. They said, we're now receiving a very acceptable signal. So I remember blurting out that, I've just discovered the secret of it all. You aren't a television broadcast engineer until you learn how to kick a piece of equipment and make it work.
Did that ever happen to you again?
Well, it may have happened, but I knew what to do.
Who would usually decide whether you would go on a remote?
How do we decide?
Yeah, how would you decide whether to go on a remote, say for breaking news? How was the decision made?
Well, that basically, after we got going and we got into news, of course, the news department made that decision. And they would get the over the wire, the different stories and so forth, and they would make an analysis as to whether it was a story worth covering or not, and then we would go. And we would, of course, at that time, try to beat the competition, and which is, got to be a very trying task. We built mobile units. That was my job too, was designing and building mobile units that would allow the job to be done quicker. We started out with just basic units, and then we started, after Kathy Fiscus, we started having radio communications that we used so we could talk to Mount Wilson and the studio and so forth. And then from that point on, we went to a station wagon type unit, which is faster and lighter. And we used a generator that we carried around in a trailer. And so we'd have power there when we got there and didn't have to worry about whether there was commercial power. And then that was followed at a later time with powering our equipment up on the way. So we'd have it all warmed up because it would take maybe 30 minutes or so to get the equipment all warmed up. And this way it would all be nice and warm. So we just connect, take the cameras and put them on the tripods and we'd get moving. But then we had the microwave to worry about. So we'd do that. Then finally, we end up using a pop-up microwave dish. And that microwave dish was, the dish, which is like a 6-foot dish, and it would lay flat, parabolic reflector. And it would lay flat on the top of the station wagon with a pivoting mechanism on it. So when it got to the remote, we'd pivot it up into position, and then we just pan it around on Mount Wilson, and with the equipment all warmed up, we were ready to go.
Did you work on that inventing that?
Oh yes, that was mine. but it was so. As I say, that was my responsibility to make sure that we got there first, and that was and this worked fine. Every time we would come up with a new way to perhaps shorten the time and make it an improvement over what the competition was doing, we'd find that shortly they started doing the same thing, and pretty soon the playing field was even. And it was this terrible frustration that was going on, trying to traveling 25 miles only to see the ambulance leave a scene, or finding a suspect being taken off to jail before we had a chance to see what was going on, or got beaten by the competition. That it happened one day. I was traveling to work on the Hollywood freeway, and the thought came to me. I was trying so hard to say, what can we do next to make sure that we can beat the competition? And whammo, out of nowhere, the thought came, the answer, of course, is to build a mobile unit in a helicopter so we can do breaking news stories and get over the traffic, get there in a hurry, and probably beat the competition. And that's where it started. The idea excited me when I thought about it, and when I got into my office at KTLA, I immediately sat down and I wrote down questions that had to be answered before I could even think about mentioning the project, let alone whether it could be approved or not.
Before we get to the helicopter, I do have
Yeah.
a few other things I'd like to ask you about, newsworthy items that happened early on. One of them is the atomic bomb test in Nevada in 1952.
Oh yes, thank you for answering that question. Yes, that was a very important story that KTLA did. They'd never been shown on television, and the networks were supposedly going to be the ones that were going to cover it, but they found out from the telephone company that the telephone company indicated it would take 6 months to get the job done, and we had 10 days before the first shoot at Frenchman's Flat outside Las Vegas in Nevada. So in desperation, one of the networks called and got a hold of Klaus Landsberg, and they said, Klaus, we got a problem. You do remotes. Do you think there's any way in the world that you could set up a feed from Las Vegas to Los Angeles and feed the networks as well in 10 days? Well, Klaus looked at that and he said back to him, he said, of course we can do it. Not knowing really whether we could do it or not, but he said, that was Klaus. I mean, he just never took no for an answer, and there was hardly anything that the impossible just took a little bit longer as far as he is concerned. And so he said, we'll do it. And so then everything started from that point on. And that night, we came up he called me up to his home in Hollywood Hills, and we spent the whole night, he and I, on the floor looking at maps, topographic maps, and we're looking at possible sites to put microwave links. It involved we didn't know at that time, but we thought it would take 6 or 7 different links to get it from where it began at Frenchman's Flat, 10 miles away from where the blast was to take place. So we spent that whole night doing that and picked out our sites, and we went right from there. We couldn't lose much sleep. I mean, we lost a lot of sleep, but we couldn't spend too much time. We had 10 days to get the job done, and we started right from that point.
Why was it so important to broadcast that test?
Well, it was definitely an earth-shaking thing, just not to be putting it into a pun, but it was a very important thing, and actually it was something that the world could see, and they did. I mean, the distribution was through the networks, and we saw it as KTLA, but we fed all stations in Los Angeles and all 3 networks. And then it went worldwide, so it was seen all over the world. So it was very important thing that had never been done before. So that's why it was so important.
What were some of the safety considerations for that shoot?
The safety considerations? Well, you mean as far as our setting it up? Well, of course, was getting out of the way of the thing, but because it was such a ferocious explosion with a big mushroom column, that we could afford to be far away. Well, we were 10 miles away. We were advised that if we were 10 miles away on Frenchman's Flat, that we could, that we'd be safe, and then we'd get pictures. And we had a location that was at Frenchman's Flat, and then we had another location that was about a half a mile or so called News Knob, where all the news people were. We had another mobile unit set up there. That was kind of like our command post. And then we had our next spot was up on top of a mountain, about 4,000 or 5,000 feet up, and we had a camera set up on that one. And it turned out that was our savior, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It wasn't too far away that we had a great shot of the mushroom from that camera. Then we went up to another spot on another hill, and then we went up to a spot called we called it Mount X. It was 10,000 feet up, and that was, and we got there by lowering John Polich, who was one of our main remote people. That's another story in itself. We skipped over that a little bit by some of the people at the station. But he was lowered down with the equipment, for the microwave equipment, and he said, and it was a receiver for the previous link, and then the one for the next one, and he spent the time up there, and they almost crashed the copter trying to get up to that spot, but fortunately they didn't. And he set up that equipment, and then we had to go up into another spot called Wrightwood, which is the next one prior to Mount Wilson, and then from Wrightwood we fed Mount Wilson transmitter. And we had to put people up there, and they had to stay up there a few days without, all by themselves, and working on generators with a receiver for the previous link and a transmitter for the following link. One thing I might just mention that I remember sitting in the mobile unit. We were waiting for something to go, and Klaus had left. Klaus always did the directing on that particular thing. And so he was out there talking to somebody, but he was away from the unit. And all of a sudden I heard a tapping on the door. And I opened the door, and lo and behold, guess who it was? It was Walter Cronkite himself in a trench coat. And he leaned over and he said, can you tell me how I can get a hold of a fellow by the name of Klaus Landsberg? And I said, well, I knew exactly who he was, and so I addressed him by his name, and he shook my hand, and so that was my first introduction to that type of a celebrity. It was quite a thrill at that time, and we got him in touch with Klaus.
Did he use any of what you had shot, or?
I beg your pardon?
What did he do?
Well, he was reporting there, doing an adjunct. They were doing some audio to lay over, and he was doing the commentation on it for the network, for his network. Nothing related to the actual pickup per se.
Any other breaking stories that you covered around that time?
Oh gosh, we did so many things. We did earthquakes. We covered one up in the north in the valley, Santa Barbara area, and we did, of course, 1971. We covered that with a telecopter. That was done with copter number 3. See, we missed some of the telecopter along the way, and so there were actually 3 versions of the telecopter.
Well, we're going to get back to that.
We're going back to it. But we did that with telecopter number 3, and we were up very shortly, about half an hour after, actually less than that, about 15 minutes after the earthquake. We had people on standby at that time because we were doing morning sunrise traffic conditions. And because of that, we had we had people at the airport, and when the earthquake happened, we got them airborne right away. So about 15 minutes after the earthquake, we were on the air with scenes from all the devastation. All of you, hospital had collapsed, and we showed pictures of that, and the freeways from 5,000 feet up, and so forth.
Generally, were you on call 24 hours?
Well, yeah, in this business, when you're in the news business and television business, you're kind of, in those days anyway, you're on call in a way, holidays and weekends and in between times, 24 hours, yes. But fortunately, we didn't have to do that every day.
How did they get in touch with you since there weren't cell phones and pagers?
Well, we didn't have cell phones in those days, basically, and so you get reached basically in your home. I mean, you let people know where you are. If you went to a restaurant, you called in and let them know what the phone number is and things of that nature, and then when you're home, of course, they knew where you were and they could get you real quick. I happened to be at home at the '71 earthquake, and I got a call at 6:30 in the morning, and I quickly got up, got dressed, and zipped into the studio, and handled my part from the master control. While Harold Morby and Larry Shear were in the copter, actually making the actual coverage.
Let's talk about the telecopter and
Okay.
The use of helicopters in broadcasting. Before the telecopter, did you ever use helicopters or try them before?
No, the only thing we did do something by helicopter one time on a city at night. We were on aboard a carrier. And was it a carrier or a battleship? I'm trying to remember. No, it was a carrier. It's a carrier. And we did so many things that sometimes at the moment it's hard to remember. But we were on the carrier, and the captain of the ship thought it might be nice if we got some kind of an overview. And so we looked up and said, well, can we go up on the top deck? He said, I could do you one better. If you could get your copter up and we could drag a cable straight up with the cameraman, you could get a beautiful shot of the top of the whole carrier. And so we thought it was great. So we thought, well, who shall we put up there? And we had one cameraman by the name of Ed Resnick. He was one of our original cameramen, but he was the lightest of the group. And we thought, wow, he's our man. So we got the camera installed, and there was hardly any room left to, and we put the camera, and it was practically in his lap. And so we went up there when the show started at the right moment, and he went straight up, and he went up about 50 to 100 feet, dragging that cable straight up from, we had it all coiled down below by the mobile unit. And we shot pictures up there of certain scenes that were up there. And then we came down, and that was the end of it. So, but that was, there was no relationship to the telecopter. Never was there any idea from anyone, including myself, that this should be carried on into news and that we could keep sustaining pictures from a helicopter. That just was not in anyone's mind. Pure and simple.
So then how did the telecopter come about?
Well, I did mention how it happened before, and it was that because of the frustration of trying to beat the competition, trying to improve, and then find that they copied what we did and so on, and then sometimes getting beaten. The thing is that the press at that time got to grading us and publishing that, grading every time there was a news event, they would grade the thing as to who got there first and who got there second and so on. And the station that got there first was the hero. And the person who got there second was a dummy. And whoever got there third was, an idiot. And so that kind of gets to you too. And particularly if you get there second or even third due to whatever circumstance. And so it was those things that were playing on my mind, and with my responsibility of making sure that we got there first. I got that idea, as I mentioned before, one day driving in on the Hollywood freeway, and then it came to me all of a sudden, how can we beat the competition? Why, of course. If we could build a news mobile unit in a helicopter, we could get over it all, get there first, avoid the traffic, and get to all the stories before anybody in the competition, and it'd be a wonderful thing. So then I drove back and that was exciting. I got back to my office there, and I sat down, and I spent about an hour and a half or so writing things that had to be done. So I made a list of, I think it was like 14 questions. I kept them. I logged them, and I kept them for posterity, and I needed them for reference. But we had all kinds of things to think about, and so I spent actually 2 days developing that list, and I still didn't mention it to anybody because I knew it would have to be something that would have to be kept secret, or the competition would probably think about it too, and try to beat us to the punch.
What were some of the elements on that list?
Well, some of the elements were, it's a long list, so I'm going to try to think about if I had a piece of paper or so forth, I could rattle them off like nothing flat. But the first place was what kind of a helicopter could do this? I mean, we need to have something that would be able to carry the weight. To be able to handle a remote in those days would take equipment that would weigh up to 2,000 pounds. I mean, transistors were not a reality at that time. Everything was tubes, and there was heavy power supplies, and so it all added up in weight to 2,000 pounds. So my thought was, how in the world can we boil down the equipment to 2,000 down to over to 400 feet? Because 400 pounds, and I knew that's the area that we'd have to get to. So I didn't really know that number at that time. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I knew that would have to go down considerably. So that we had to figure out what was available and what would be a reasonable cost to lease or buy, so that the station perhaps would be, I knew that someday they were going to have to know about the project, and hopefully they would approve it. I was just dreaming at this point with high hopes. And so I knew that had to be researched. And then I had to know things like how much weight could the helicopter carry, how long can a copter stay in the air before refueling, what were the FAA, the regulatory body for aircraft, what did they have to, what were their requirements for helicopters covering news events, how high, were you limited, how did you have to stay up 2,000 feet or 1,000 feet, or could you go down to 500 feet, so on. Could you land, and so forth. These are all questions that had to be answered. The next thing was, how in the world could we get a picture from the mobile unit flying around anywhere in a 50-mile radius in Los Angeles and get a picture and sound steady so it could reach the studio eventually and be broadcast to the public? I mean, that would have to be done. I knew that it had to be done, so I had to do a propagation analysis. So I knew that I'd have to get a lot of topographical maps and things of that nature and study it and make some calculations to see whether the signals could be carried with a transmitter and an antenna in the copter that was flying around at different altitudes and so on in different locations, and have that transmit. I figured that what we would have to do is to transmit to Mount Wilson and use that as a receiving point, then transmit that back down to the studios in Hollywood, and then back ultimately to the transmitter and then out to the public. And but the main job was getting it to Mount Wilson. And so once that had to be done, the trick was to how to do it. I mean, what kind of an antenna would you use that would make this possible? There were different options there to use, and the other one was what kind of a positioning system would you use to keep the antennas at both locations pointing at one another? I mean, move away and you have no signal. So and it boiled down really to 3 different types of systems. And the first one that came to mind was a brute force system, where we would we use a lot of power in the microwave at the transmitter in the copter, and then use an omnidirectional antenna and be able to hopefully get a signal, which I didn't know because I hadn't done the mathematics on it, to when we're flying around places in Los Angeles, keeping a steady signal. That was ruled out because, first place, we didn't have any transmitters, microwave transmitters. We were going to use a 2 gigahertz or 2,000 megahertz transmitter, which we had license for and used on remotes. Would use that in the copter, but to get the power that would be required to get a signal, a noise-free signal to the transmitter building on Mount Wilson as a receiving location, it was just impractical, and it would take too long to get that developed. So we ruled that out, and then the next alternate was to use a positioning system, an automatic positioning system, where a servo mechanism, where both antennas would seek each other and point at each other and so on. And that turned out to be, at that time, too lengthy a project. We just didn't have the time. We wouldn't have the time to do that. I knew that we'd have to get on the air within 4 to 6 months, or somebody was going to maybe come up with an idea and so on. They weren't, but it was a paranoid thought, And so that was ruled out, that system. And then all of a sudden, I thought of as an alternate compromise system. And that was to use a system that was a combination directive system and non-directive. And I remember, in understanding transmitters, which I was responsible for our main transmitter too on Mount Wilson, that the helical antenna, which is a spiral type of antenna, and big, maybe 8 feet tall and weighs a couple hundred pounds and things like that. It was a helical antenna, and that would be used on main transmitters. And I thought, well, an antenna like that might be able to be redesigned down to something we could use, and that would be small, and it would have, looking down on it, if you look down, the horizontal, it would be omnidirectional. But looking at a side view of the antenna, it would sending out information 6 degrees above the horizon and 6 degrees below the horizon all the way around. And it turned out by calculation that would give a 12 dB, it would give a 12 degree angle all the way around. And by so doing, it would give an antenna gain of 9 decibels. And that would mean that the picture was basically doubles for every 3 dB. So it would be double, and double is 4, and 4 times 4 times 2 is 8. So it would then be 8 times the power and gain through the antenna, which we needed in order to help the signal arrive at the receiving location noise-free, or basically noise-free.
Let's stop there to change the tape.
Okay.